Um, I think mourning the loss of newspaper staff is something that's very interesting. I don't mourn the loss of newspaper staff because I see where the slack is being picked up on the internet. I think on a national level, especially, one of the reasons we're starting to see some of the positive changes in this country that we are is because of alternative media sources on the internet, like Talking Points Memo, like Daily Kos. The democratization of news and the democratization of thought and opinion has really led to kind of a greater understanding of our political system, and it exposed a lot of the big problems with corporatized Fourth Estate. On the local level, I think that's something that's been a little bit slower to materialize. I mean, you can't talk about the local level. I mean, it's all individual cities and towns, and they all have their own papers and voices, their own writers, and their own problems.
I kind of disagree with some of what you said in that I don't think the internet side and the newspaper side necessarily relate. I personally think the downsizing of newspapers is not a good thing. I think the cutting of staff is not a good thing. I do think the growth of the internet, the growth of bloggers, the growth of all these sites is wonderful and has done more and is getting more people educated. But I still think that would have happened even if newspapers wouldn't be shrinking. And I just don't. You can look with the Times-Picayune here. You can look LA Times. All these companies. A lot of the companies have cuts. Some of these companies don't replace writers when they leave, and I just don't think that's a good thing. And I think whether it's right or wrong or whether it's a good thing or bad thing, when you are working for quote mainstream media, you have access. You can apply pressure points that you can't do in other areas, and I think that helps keep people in check and to be a watchdog. Karen and Sarah did wonderful work and some wonderful prep work on this whole the NOAA investigation. But I think the beauty of this was that bloggers and all of this came together with the mainstream media, and we and this story that shed some light on something that's potentially just awful was out there. And Karen and Sarah couldn't have done that alone, because if they didn't have the viewing audience of WWL-TV and the viewing audience of WWL-TV.com, it may not have gotten out there. But at the same time, if I wouldn't have had a Karen or Sarah to do the legwork that unfortunately is not possible for the most part in TV media right now, the story would have never come about, probably. So I think they're separate issues.
Well, I think you just got to the heart of why I threw that question out there for the most part. What you're talking about is the lack of infrastructure or capacity to do full-time investigative journalism at major media or mainstream media outlets, where they're kind of de facto outsourced that capacity to the public. So you're more dependent upon...
And we're not talking about, investigation tonight at 10, something that will let you speed through the red lights and they can't detect you. I mean, this is serious stuff we're talking about.
Right. I mean, and I don't know if anybody else wants to jump in on this, but Simon, in his article, talks about, this is before the internet went big, the combination of newspapers across the country into conglomerates and the increased focus on profit for the stockholders led to a lot of reorganizations that streamlined newsrooms for the most part and cut staffs to the point where they aren't able to. You don't have a beat reporter who knows everybody, who goes out and it's just his job to cover the courthouse at night and to develop investigative stories that eventually make it into the paper. That function now has been left to the public for the most part.
Well, it's left somewhat
to the citizen journalists, and I would call them, I don't want to call bloggers amateur journalists. I'd rather call them citizen journalists, to be honest with
I think
you.
it was
Because
amateur
I think-
investigators. I think
What's that?
Amateur investigators
Yeah,
is the
amateur
word.
investigators. I wouldn't call
Recovery herders.
You guys certainly seem to have your chops. I wouldn't sure change what
We've
to
got
say.
an inside joke that throws around the term vanity blogger. I think that if you called us vanity journalists, a lot of us would be kind of pleased to hear that.
You know,
You're certainly a vanity journalist. And I think that is, I wouldn't necessarily mourn, fewer newspaper jobs, but because I think it'll come through in other forms of media. But what I mourn would be, that reporter, as you say, who spent day in and day out at the courthouse. And a lot of times now, there's a certain degree of catch-up that you have to do as a journalist. If we're doing a story, we have to do a lot of background that we wouldn't have necessarily, if my beat was, downtown, city council exclusively, I wouldn't have to go through, because I would know, because that's my beat. But now what I do is I go through over and over what's been already said, and then making sure I understand.
That's dangerous. I will say this, and I know some people, because I read the blogs, and obviously some people are critical of the Times-Picayune, but I do think that, I think I saw Gordon here a little while ago, and Gordon Russell from the Times-Picayune, in my opinion, is the best journalist in the city, and he does some phenomenal work. And so me personally, I think we are lucky in New Orleans right now, because I still think the Times-Picayune does some wonderful work. I think, TV-wise, I think we do some pretty good work. And I think we have this group before us and other people who are also, invested and interested, whether it's, Sandy Rosenthal, who I see, or Karen, or so many of you. And I think, unfortunately, we're not the norm, but I think we're lucky here in New Orleans.
Very lucky here in New Orleans. I grew up near Los Angeles, enough said about TV news there. But after the storm, I was in Portland, and you would think that a city that wired would have something decent, if not interesting, to say, and you might as well be watching Entertainment Tonight. It was terrible. One thing I wanted to pick on what Lee said was that in the 1980s, the national networks, the CBS, ABC, NBC, moved from a model where the news division was kind of a pride of place sort of thing for the network to something they expected to make money from. And that move, more than anything, has trickled down to local TV, to newspapers, and that's one thing that makes me excited about bloggers is most of them aren't getting paid, so they can write what the hell they want.